So welcome again. I'm Bud Harrell, your program chair. In this plenary, we focus on religious education and public life in the global community. And one of the most important moral, public, and global issues of our time is care for creation. This session is designed to stimulate imaginative, fresh ways of envisioning care for creation and imaginative ways of responding to the ecological crisis. My hope is that the session will help us, each of us in the REA as a whole, to begin to imagine how we can take some initiatives, perhaps, to address this important public issue of our time from a religious education perspective. Our moderator for the plenary is Dr. Miriam Martin. Miriam is an associate professor at St. Paul University in Ottawa. She holds the Mercy Presentation Chair in Religious Education. Recently, she was appointed director of the New School of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality. She teaches and researches in the areas of religious education and catechesis, liturgy, ecology, and recent publications focus on human nature, relationships, and religious education. And welcome, Miriam Martin.
It's my pleasure to introduce this cosmic trio. They will speak, Timothy will speak first, and then Jennifer, and then Kyle, and then we're back to Tim. So they said it was a sandwich affair. I'll introduce Tim. Timothy is an associate professor in the Aylward Chair of Christian Education and Youth Ministry at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, where they have a 7-acre working farm. His research and teaching have focused primarily on the spiritual and vocational aspirations of young people and engaged faith education on the ground. Ecology, justice, peace movements, communal movements, and alternative forms of church. His publications include the book Created in Delight, Youth, Church, and Mending the World. Jennifer Ayres is an assistant professor of religious education and the director of religious education program at Candler School of Theology here in Atlanta at Emory. Jen's research interests include religious environmental education, social activism, and religious identity, faith formation in the context of popular culture, and practical feminist theology. Her most recent book is Good Food, Grounded in Practical Theology. And she shared that working through this text in part has drawn her more deeply into the ecological questions, and she is working on a project with others in cultivating ecological faith. Kyle Kramer is the executive director of the Passionists Earth and Spirit Center in Louisville, Kentucky. Kyle and his family spent 15 years previously as organic farmers and homesteaders in Spencer County, Indiana. He's currently a columnist for the St. Anthony Messenger magazine and serves as the Catholic Climate Ambassador for the Catholic Climate Covenant. He's the author of A Time to Plant, Life Lessons in Work, Prayer, and Dirt. And he said he'd fill in the rest for you. So we give a warm welcome to our 3 presenters.
Hello and thank you. And I'm going to take a couple seconds to drop that and enter into the real program. And just want to say that for me, as a little added part of this, for me, there is no disconnection between my work with young people and ecology. The questions that we're about how we leave a world for next generations are at the core of ministry with youth. And in all my work, I try to resist, it's probably better if I stand in front of the microphone, isn't it? In my work, I try to resist the idea that youth ministry is about attraction, or about enticement, or about some kind of future for the church. I don't care about the future for the church. I care about a healthy world for our young people. And if the church is involved with that, spectacular. It's been a place and a source for meaning for thousands of years, and it needs to remain that. But if it isn't, if there are folks here who actually believe in the movement of the Holy Spirit, something else will happen. And that's where my work lies. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of less than kind words about where we stand. 50 years ago this week, President Lyndon Johnson's Science Advisory Committee sent him a report entitled Restoring the Quality of Our Environment. The report presented to the President the problems that could arise if we continued to burn fossil fuels. I quote, within a few short centuries, we are returning to the air a significant part of the carbon that was slowly extracted by plants and buried in the sediments during 500 million years. The report went on to declare that if we continued to burn fossil fuels at the rate that they were in 1965, we might in 50 years reach 350 parts per million, the point that most scientists say is the point of no return. Well, there was a number of things in the report that they got right. They also reported on lead poisoning and a number of other things in that. They missed the 350 parts per million. This year we hit 400 parts per million, which is past the point of no return that most scientists talk about. And when we talk about parts per million, it doesn't sound like that much, but what we're talking about is the thickness of the blanket around the Earth and how much heat we're willing to trap and how we're willing to live in that heat. And that's where we stand right now, is we're at 400 parts per million. If we continue to burn at this rate, we'll be hitting 450 pretty quickly in about 25 years. And at 450, we're no longer talking about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius raise in temperature, we're talking about 4 to 6. And at that point, vast swaths of the world become uninhabitable. And we're beginning to see some of those temperatures in records right now. So I want to just talk briefly about this. This is the environmental thing. So for this year, just to get a perspective on what's happening, we're a full 1/10 of a degree warmer than any other year in history for this year, 2015. This is where we're tracking. I'm Mr. Good News right now. This is where we are. And in that tracking, if you get a sense of from January to July 2015, these are the differences in what would be considered normal global average temperature. The blues and the deep blues are less than or under global normal average. The whites are pretty much hitting the mean. The reds, and the deeper the red, is the more a higher level that we've moved past that mean. Now, one of the interesting things, if we go back to the previous slide, if we look at the other previous warmest years, it's 2015, 2014, 2013, 2010, 2009, and then 1998. We've had no coldest year on record in 35 years. And so we are in a place that is called outside of normal human history. All of human culture developed at temperatures less than what we're now experiencing. So if you look at this is the famous Keeling curve. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. If you look at just how temperatures have tracked for the previous 400,000 years, just kind of up, down, up, down. About 1950, we hit kind of the highest parts per million, CO2, highest CO2 levels previous years. And then we have from 1950 to now. This is the hockey stick that makes so many people angry in certain realms. But the hockey stick keeps getting proven over and over again. And we've moved past what might happen to a time where we're now observing what is happening. And so I tied this at the initial point with youth ministry, but we really are at a point in our history where we're facing limits that will last generations. And the difficulty with this is there is no problem out there called the environment that we have to solve, or this space separate from us called creation. There's the air we breathe, the water we drink and rely upon for health, our oceans, our soils, our forests, all the different ways that we have a context for human life and creaturely life to thrive. There is nothing separate from us called the environment. There's only the place we live. Even when we're in a room that is completely climate controlled, outside these walls, there is a world, and inside these walls, there is the air we breathe, all the things that we rely on for our own health. There's nothing separate from us. And one of the things I want to challenge all of us to think about is that as the top report from the UN and the bottom report from the U.S. Pick this up in my notes. The top report was from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the second report is the U.S. National Climate Assessment and Development Advisory Committee. And the top one's from 2014, and the bottom overview's from 2015. These folks are telling us that life is changing, that we're hitting a time where Kansas City will begin to have up to 6 months by 2030 to 2040, 6 months of days over 90 degrees. That Atlanta needs to get used to perpetual drought. And that the summers in Atlanta will become times where we're looking at over 100 degrees for 70 to 90 days. So we begin to think about how we're going to live in this new reality that we're pulling together. And it's not off in the future only. Right now, farmers in the Midwest, as they try to grow corn or soybeans or other crops, or oystermen in the Pacific Northwest, or maple syrup harvesters in the Northeast, are all finding that their livelihoods have been changed significantly by the changes in climate. And so we are facing limits for generations. There are not any quick solutions. And we are creating the air, the water, the soils, the forests, the oceans, and the fisheries that will determine the health and thriving of life for thousands of years. We are setting the context for our children's, up to 7 times 7 generations. This is what we're doing right now. And so it's not just, but I want to say, before I conclude my time and turn it over to Jen, New York Times climate reporter Andrew Revkin a few years ago was asked if climate change was the most important story of our day. He replied, no, climate change really isn't the most important story of our day. Climate change is a subset of that story, which is that we are coming of age on a finite planet and only just now recognizing that it's finite. So how we manage infinite aspirations of a species that's been on this explosive trajectory, not just of population growth, but of consumptive appetite. How can we make a transition to be a more stabilized and still prosperous relationship with the earth and each other is the story of our time. And it's a story about conflict. It's a story about the fact that there are 1 billion teenagers on the planet right now. 130 years ago, there were only 1 billion people altogether, grandparents and kids altogether. Now there are 1 billion teenagers. And they could just as easily become child soldiers and drug dealers as innovators and the owners of small companies. And little tweaks in their prospects, a little bit of education, a little bit of opportunity, a microloan or something that gets girls into schools. Those things, that's the story of our time. And climate change is like a symptom of the story of our time, meaning our energy choices right now come with a lot of emissions of greenhouse gases, and we don't have a lot of new choices. And if we don't have a lot of new choices, we're going to have a lot of warming. And so, with Andrew Revkin, I want to stand here for you today and articulate again, we are at the time where we're realizing that we live in a finite system, on a finite planet, and are hitting the ends of the resources available, coming off of 2 or 3 generations that have lived with energy sources undreamed of throughout the history of our species. And yet now we're coming to the end of those energy times. And this future, in many ways, appears to be dark. That the planet is shattered and broken in ways, and the systems for healing. We've taken out the capacity for resilience, even as we're taking out resources. But I want to end this first time with a quote from Rebecca Solnit, what I call my literary crush, that we can all agree that the future is dark. But the darkness may be the darkness of the grave, or it may be the darkness of the womb. And we have to determine, what are we birthing or what are we burying? Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. You know, that's a whole lot of bad news. Yes, it's waking up.
There it goes.
All right. That's a lot of bad news. And one of the things we talked about when we were preparing for this panel is that there are a variety of responses to this bad news, including denial. We may be seeing a little bit of that in our political context now. Dependence on technological solutions, so trying to make our cars better, trying to make our energy sources better. Or finally, despair, giving up altogether. All of these responses are somewhat problematic, but I think that they confront our field of religious education with some core questions that some of you have already begun working on. Our colleagues like Mary Elizabeth Moore and Dory Baker and Joyce Mercer and Miriam Martin and Tim Van Meter, you and several others have begun this work already for our field. Questions posed to religious education include questions like, how do humans relearn how to care, how to redirect human affections toward this sacred earth, mobilizing the wisdom embodied in our religious traditions? Or how do we cultivate trust and hope in God's ongoing creative work in the world? Or how do we nurture human hearts and commitments to not only withstand, but even thrive in the long, hard work of being ecological inhabitants? This kind of religious education has to nurture learners in an ecological way of life, cultivating in us a desire and capacity both to locate ourselves in particular places and to live well in a place. It is to live as a member or a biotic citizen of what Aldo Leopold called the land community. Environmental education scholar David Orr describes this capacity as inhabitants. He contrasts it with residents. He says to reside, he warns, is to live as a transient and as a stranger to one's place, to become merely consumers supplied by invisible networks that damage their places and those of others. The life of the inhabitant, in contrast, he says, is governed by the boundaries of sufficiency, organic harmony, and by the discipline of paying attention to minute particulars. From a theological perspective, inhabitants is a way of orienting ourselves as members of an ecological household. The planet has been described as our only or our common home by international climate scientists and by the Pope. Indeed, the English word ecology shares a root with the Greek term for household, eco and oikos. If we understand ourselves to be inhabitants of this place, the members of this household, then despair, denial, and the quick fix simply will not do. What kind of education is what I want us to think about? What kind of education will it take to cultivate among people of faith and conscience this kind of ecological awareness and commitment? So a brief word on ecological and environmental education theory and practice, something that I've been a little immersed in this project this year. The question is not whether we are doing environmental education, David Orr says. He says, indeed, all education is environmental education in the sense that our ecological context is sometimes a null curriculum in our educational systems. And I think we might ask if it's a null curriculum in religious education as well. In other words, in religious or theological education, when ecological questions are considered a niche interest, we communicate that religious practice and identity is not necessarily bound or responsible to its ecological context. So we might say with David Orr that all religious education is environmental education, but how can we be sure that it is good and intentional and grounded ecological education? We might be informed by tensions and developments in the field of environmental education itself. In fact, the very name of the field is sometimes contested. There's a whole list of names. Some theorists in the field prefer the term ecological education to the term environmental education because of the latter's sometimes tendency to focus on the tasks of learning about nature, learning about the environment, which perhaps unwittingly encourages us to hold nature at somewhat of a distance, something to be studied from a distance. Maybe it's like the objectifying distance of the arrogant eye, to borrow Sally McFaig's term. I'll name her once more. We heard about her earlier today. So some theorists, like Gillian Judson, prefer the term ecological, which more clearly characterizes the Earth as a complex, interdependent system of which we humans are a part, a constitutive part. An ecological context is necessarily something in which all beings live, are nourished, and contribute. An environment might be limited to something like a setting or a landscape, the backdrop for human activity. Dory and Joyce called attention to this misuse of nature in religious education in their essay, Nature as Teacher. To name what we are doing as ecological education is to emphasize its relational, interdependent, and experiential character. It's about who we are in relationship to human and earth communities, and the way of education that deeply forms human character and commitment in this way takes time. This is a challenge because in an educational system fixated on measuring success, allotting a great deal of time to ecological education might feel like a risk that is just too great to take. So instead, we try to fit something, anything, into the curriculum that might nurture some kind of environmental learning, a video or an article or an experiment. We try to cover the content now in hopes that it will bear some sort of ecological fruit later. And while these constrained efforts might yield some development of ecological capacities in learners, they reflect a privileging of what David Orr calls fast knowledge. The assumptions at the root of fast knowledge assume that with increased knowledge, and the sooner the better, comes better living and more just practices. If we knew more, if we just knew more, we could solve more of our problems. So let's get to it. That's the assumption of fast knowledge. Slow knowledge, on the other hand, is shaped and calibrated to fit a particular ecological and cultural context. It does not imply lethargy, but rather carefulness and patience. The aim of slow knowledge is resilience, harmony, and the preservation of the patterns that connect. Slow knowledge is nurtured when we learn within a community that is motivated by affection and commitment and assumes that wisdom, not cleverness, is the proper aim of all true learning. And that human ignorance is not an entirely solvable problem. It is rather an inescapable part of the human condition. Now, for the sake of time, trying to do fast knowledge, I suppose, I am tracing the sharpest contours of Orr's, the contrast that Orr is drawing here, but I think his point is an important one, that it is in the slow cultivation of wisdom that the promise of ecological consciousness lies. Ecological consciousness is cultivated together and shared, deeply related to the context in which it is nurtured, and acknowledges, indeed embraces, human limitations. And most importantly, it demands our patience and attentiveness, engaging our senses, our emotions, and our creativity. It will not be rushed. And if religious communities are anything, they are unhurried, shall we say? These ongoing communities of commitment are, in some ways, optimal sites for the kind of slow knowledge necessary to cultivate ecological consciousness. So, ecological education describes its purpose as the cultivation of ecological literacy or ecological consciousness, which is the comprehension of the world's interrelatedness, and in light of that knowledge, a life lived accordingly. I was stunned when I first read this definition from David Orr because it's almost exactly, or at least pretty close to what I would name as a core purpose for religious education. A sensibility of the world's interrelatedness, maybe adding a theological dimension to that, and then cultivating a life lived according to that awareness. From a theological perspective, however, I'm inclined to add the cultivation of ecological faith as an orienting purpose for ecological religious education. These days, I'm provisionally defining ecological faith as comprising a set of affections or virtues that attune Christian consciousness to its ecological context, its ecological roots, and its ecological responsibility. These affections and virtues are cultivated in response to a God who creates, sustains, and renews the world. This is a risky and vulnerable way of life. When affections are piqued in the process of learning, we sometimes tend to distrust or ignore them. We ashamedly wipe away tears of grief when we see habitats destroyed, animals suffering, woodlands mowed down. We feel embarrassed by the visceral response of wonder and joy upon placing our bare feet in the dirt or holding a vulnerable animal in our hands. But ecological faith is necessarily emotional, and its cultivation depends on practices and reflection that welcome human feeling. It is, to quote my colleague Don Salyers, humanity at full stretch before God. We must be able to bring our full selves, rejoicing, loving, weeping, healing, to bear in the work of tending our ecological home. Rachel Carson said that it is not half as important to know as to feel. If facts, she said, are the seeds that later produce knowledge and wisdom, then the emotions and the impressions of the senses are the fertile soil in which the seeds must grow. This image is actually from the first appearance of the essay on wonder from the 1950s. That's her nephew. The cultivation of ecological faith invites us to expand and trust our affections, to recognize that the earth, our home, is also an appropriate object toward which we might direct our wonder, our love, our grief, and our healing. Thus, ecological religious education must engage not only our bodies, but also our emotions, and often the two happen together, such as in this case.
How do you know where we're going? Each group that comes to Tabla is taken on a trust block, a blindfolded trust block. Before the sound of my voice, everyone can take off their blindfold, and I'd like you to say the very first word that comes into your mind. 1, 2, 3. Whoa.
When you are really in touch with the majesty of creation, your first response is, wow. And that wow is the basis of prayer. Part of what Teva is here to do is to link the personal aha moments with the larger scheme of things, that all of creation is one, and we are bound up with the frogs and the ferns and everything else.
Without idealizing the naivete of children, we might still notice how visceral, how embodied, how emotional, how uninhibited their expressions of wonder are. Carson theorized that as we grow older, wonder serves as an unfailing antidote against the boredom and disenchantment of later years, the sterile preoccupation with things that are artificial, the alienation from the sources of our strength. Wonder leads us to curiosity, but even more fundamentally to love and desire. Love. We will not fight to save what we do not love. The stark conclusion drawn by evolutionary biologist Stephen Gould insists that we must love our ecological context. But how can this be? Is love not something that is exchanged in tender moments between lovers, friends, or parents and children? Biologist E.O. Wilson, however, argues that an affinity for other life forms, which he called biophilia, is inscribed into human biology and consciousness. It's innate, he said. But it may not feel that innate to many of us. Even when we are fiercely trying to love and protect nature, we sometimes think of this work as primarily technical in nature. We want to find the solutions that will make the earth inhabitable, that will make the earth less vulnerable, less likely to die. Of course, this is no way to love. It is no more a way to love God's earth, our home, than it is a way to love another human being. It is antiseptic and calculated. Even in its benevolence, it is controlling in some way. It denies the inexhaustible mystery of the beloved, and it robs the lover of the wonder of joy, fear, discovery, and vulnerability that comes with the perpetual work of learning and loving another. So how shall we love? This was Sally McFague's question. On the one hand, ecological faith must be built on an agapic love that demands our care for the earth even when we do not personally seem to benefit from it. On the other hand, ecological faith needs erotic love too. The term most often associated with sexual passion, eros, connotes longing, desire, and embodied experience. Humans in eros enter into the mystery of the other, making themselves vulnerable to heartbreak and to grief. By risking this kind of vulnerability, however, humans also approach a wholly embodied connection with the other. And so it is with nature, is it not? The visceral connection between a human and an animal's gaze, a fiddlehead fern's complexity, a yawning valley, or a crashing wave. These embodied and primal exchanges need the language of eros, even for a Presbyterian like me. Grief, the vulnerability. These dispositions of wonder and desire are, if nothing else, the source of human vulnerability and joy. While we know instinctively that to live this way is to embrace vulnerability, what else could bring about the unmistakable lump in the throat or the quickened heartbeat? One need not dig very far, though, to find the root of that vulnerability. It's death. To choose love, especially the visceral, embodied love of eros, necessarily entangles us in the reality of loss. To love another human, an animal, a place, is to lower our defenses to a degree that real loss is possible. We willingly make ourselves vulnerable to the experience of grief. What practices do we need in religious education that will help us deal with the grief that accompanies ecological loss? Finally, hope. wonder, love, grief, and hope. For many years, environmentalists defined sustainability as their hope for an ecological future. Sustainability, however, no longer adequately represents the future for which environmentalists long. In our globalized economic and political networks, many suggest that Earth's human civilizations have now passed a point of no return. In fact, Tim brought that happy news just a few minutes ago. And the establishment of systems and practices that are economically and environmentally sustainable is no longer realistic. This sounds fatalistic. And yet people of faith and conscience have not given up hope for a good future. Instead, they're exploring language that both acknowledges the impossibility of the restoration of a mythical original state, and they are finding language that finds hope in an unknown future with unknown outcomes, language like resilience. So how can ecological religious education cultivate emotionally and environmentally resilient communities? To do so requires both the kind of hope that is, as David Orr puts it, a verb with its sleeves rolled up, but also assumes, as Emily Towns has put it, that God is not through. Thank you.
There's always a technical difficulty.
Okay. To bring it over to this.
I don't know how to start the presentation.
Oh, I just have to slide it.
Oh, I see. Sorry about that. I'm using all my time on the technology. There we go. There we are. Okay. We hope. There we go. Well, I want to echo and add to some of Tim's and Jen's ideas by exploring three important ecological themes from Pope Francis and his new encyclical Laudato Si, which focuses on the environment. So why do I want to look at Francis? First of all, because he's a lot more cheerful than Tim is. And second, because he is arguably the most popular and influential religious figure on the planet right now. And by his words, and especially by his example, he is an incredibly effective religious educator. He has stimulated the religious imagination like few others. And Laudato Si is perhaps the most high-profile religious engagement of ecological issues. And it's not just directed to Catholics. He wrote this, quote, to every person living on this planet. So I want to look at three themes that come from the subtitle of this encyclical on care for our common home. Home is a theme that's already come up, household and oikos, that the idea that we belong to this planet, that it is our home and not just a prison that our religion might help us escape from. Good religious education needs to help us reconnect with our home in meaningful ways by smelling like the sheep, as Pope Francis says. And it's a common home. It's a home that we share together, all of us creatures, human and non-human, in all places at all times. His phrase for this is integral ecology, that we have a common fate. We rise and fall as one. And finally, I want to look at care, that Pope Francis is calling all of us to an ecological conversion that is just as profound and just as important as a religious conversion. So the idea of home and smelling like the sheep. For Francis, religion is not born in an ivory tower. It doesn't come down from a mile-high pulpit. It is like a field hospital in a battlefield. True religion invites us down into the thick of life, so close among the sheep that you begin to smell just like them. In other words, true religion helps you remove the layers of insulation between yourself and the world around you, between yourself and the needs around you. And for Francis, this has meant giving up the papal palace to live much more simply and in community. It's meant giving up bulletproof popemobiles and being much more out in the open and close to the people. It's meant especially being with the poor and the vulnerable, washing the feet of inmates, visiting the homeless when he's here in this country in Washington, D.C. So when it comes to ecological concerns specifically, I think that smelling like the sheep also means removing those layers of insulation between our lives and the creation. As Tim said, most of us have very little meaningful connection to the natural world because we live in a culture and in an economy where that is possible now. It is possible to live and work in isolation from the earth in this windowless, climate-controlled room, for example, because we can, in one form or another, pay other people to take care of all of our needs for us. So how do we, in that situation, at this current time, how do we start smelling like the sheep? How do we remember that the earth is our home? As religious educators, I think we need to remember, first of all, that creation is the fundamental source of religious revelation. It is the source of all of our religious symbols, our sacred rivers, our mountains, our wheat, and our wine. And why is this? Because it came first. It preceded all of our scriptures, all of our rituals, our imagination. And because matter contains and reveals spirit. Because the world is enchanted. And I have to say, I learned this not from my catechism, though I should have. I learned it from my kids. On our farm, we would walk often through our woodlot. In fact, that's where these pictures come from. And I would always walk through thinking like a lumberjack. What trees did I need to take down for lumber, for firewood, to manage the forest, etc.? But my kids, they walked through an enchanted world of fairies perching in the branches and angels flitting around the trunks of these trees. That tree right there was the source of years of battles in my family, because of course I wanted to cut it down. It was never going to make any good lumber. Might as well make good firewood out of it. And of course I lost the battle. And this tree, these trees I should say, it's hard to see in this picture, but those are two trees that kind of twist around each other. We always call those the hugging trees and the kissing trees, and that, according to my kids at least, that was where all of the fairies and the angels had their headquarters on our farm. So, you know, this enchantment I'm talking about with the natural world, it is instinctual for kids, but it's at risk because of what Richard Louv calls nature deficit disorder. And the cure, I think, or one of the cures, to be very blunt, is less screen time. I've done a lot of things wrong as a parent, but one of the things my wife and I think have done right is that we really limited what we allowed our kids to engage with electronically, and instead we just shoved them out the door on the farm to play for as long as they wanted, mostly unsupervised. And it worked. They have these, everybody loves their kids, but they have these incredible attention spans and imaginations that I don't see in their peers, and I think that is one of the reasons. So to live in this home, we contemplate the beauty of nature. And this might be dramatic beauty, like the Grand Canyon. It might be the gritty, mundane beauty of a weed pushing its way up through a sidewalk. We can contemplate the mystery of the created world. Particularly in this time, we are gifted with the universe story, the idea of an unfolding universe over 13.8 billion years. Thomas Berry and Brian Swim have given great voice to that. A story in which spirit and matter are wedded and unfold together as the universe becomes conscious of itself through us, as it becomes more and more complex, materially and spiritually. And there are two wonderful practices I want to share with y'all. I mean, religious educators, I hope, we are practical people. And one is called To Engage the Mystery of the Universe, the Cosmic Walk. It was developed by Miriam McGillis in Genesis Farm. And that's where you take a long rope and put it in a spiral representing the 13.8 billion years of our history as an evolving universe, with the Big Bang in the middle. And all of these candles slowly lit one by one, representing the different stages of evolution of the universe. And you'll see that all of the things pertaining to human history are the last 2 or 3 feet of the rope. It's an incredibly powerful exercise. We do it at the Interfaith Spirituality Center I run in Louisville, and it never fails to astound people. And another one that I like is what I just call hanging out on the planet. And that is, take a group of kids or take yourself out on a dark starlit night, lie down on the ground, look up in the sky, but instead of looking up, imagine that you are stuck to the underside of the planet, looking down into the depths of space. If you want a moment of religious ecstasy crossed with roller coaster dizziness, try that, to contemplate the mystery of nature. We smell like the sheep. We connect with our home when we connect with the suffering of nature as well, as Jen brought up. It can be the dramatic suffering of mountaintop removal mining. I've been on mountaintop removal tours with the Glenmary priest, John Rouse. I've seen these mountains and what they look like. I've seen the mining process. I've seen the streams run orange, and it feels like a kick in the gut. We can connect with the subtle suffering of nature that you have to have eyes to see. This is a beautiful rolling cornfield in the Midwest. This is a cornfield that is losing 8 to 12 tons of topsoil every season off of every acre. I lived next to cornfields like these on our farm for 15 years, and I watched my neighbor every year take a bulldozer out, trying to push eroded soil back into the gullies that had washed out so badly he got his tractors stuck in them. The suffering of nature can be dramatic, and it can be subtle. And in all of it, it is, in Christian language, it is Christ crucified. We can connect with the utility of nature, the practical utility of nature, certainly by farming and gardening. Food is one of the most essential ways we are connected to the earth. And so it's a perfect way to reclaim our connection in a meaningful way. And living on a farm, I can say that butchering animals, butchering livestock and wild game is about as real as it gets. And I've seen how my kids connect with their food as they see it grown. I see it particularly in the center. We have 21 acres in the middle of Louisville with gardens and fields, and we bring in kids from food desert areas in very poor parts of Louisville. And we show them how food comes from the garden to the kitchen to their plates, and they finally see it. You can connect with you can connect with the utility of nature through solar power. It not only is good for the planet, but on our farm we had a huge solar array, and my kids and I loved to geek out on it. They could see what it meant for our energy use when it was a cloudy day. They knew how to read the dials and the gauges, and so we are forced in such ways to pay attention to the world that gives us our being. You can do it by collecting rainwater in barrels and learning the art of enoughness, because the water you have is not endless. It's contained in the number of barrels you have. And houses of worship, religious education programs, we can do these things on our grounds. We can educate folks to do them at home. The Pope brings up another theme with the word common, and that is integral ecology, that everything, as we've said so many times, is interconnected and interdependent. And that can be on the quantum level, where you have a pair of electrons spinning together, and you move one to the other side of the room, or the other side of the planet, or the other side of the universe, and when the first one changes its spin and its direction, the other one knows about it and changes as well. It can be the butterfly flapping its wings in Hong Kong and causing a thunderstorm in Kansas City on those 90-degree days. Integral ecology means that in this interconnected world, we are integrally connected with it, and that our social and our ecological challenges are the same challenge. They are the same sides of one coin. I call this the people and the planet, always held together with common fate and common concern. This is not a new idea, but I think the Pope has brought it forward in a very powerful and tangible way. And what the Pope has also done is kept always before our eyes that these issues of commonality on this planet are always issues of concern for the poor and justice for the poor. Because, and when he says the poor, he doesn't just mean those lining up at a soup kitchen in Atlanta. He means the 1 billion people on this planet right now struggling daily for enough to eat, for water that's not going to make them sick, and another 2 billion people on this planet who are just one small misstep or disaster away from joining that first billion. These are the ones who have caused the least environmental harm, but will suffer the most because of a degraded planet, because of eroded soils, a warming climate, drought, migration. And this is a justice issue. If we are going to teach as religious educators, as we should, that our religions bind us all together and to the planet, we have to teach that sharing our common home is a basic and fundamental issue of justice between the rich and the poor. When I say the rich, I mean the rich like all of us. If you go to globalrichlist.com and plug in your annual salary and your savings, it'll show you where you stack up against the world's population. And I did it, and I am the 1%. And I bet all of us in here are too. And finally, care, or what the Pope calls ecological conversion, turning around and changing our ways collectively and individually. It looks, first of all, very practical. We in the developed world moderate our lifestyles, and the Pope gives wonderfully practical laundry lists in this encyclical about the things we can do, from keeping our houses cooler and wearing warmer clothes to reducing our water consumption, recycling, public transport, etc. But what he's doing here is not just giving us yet another checklist of virtuous creation care behaviors. What he's doing is actually showing us an essential part of religious formation. A couple years back, I think it was me who invented this, maybe I stole it from someone that didn't know, but I thought of the term eco-asceticism, which is essentially applying the value of fasting as a religious value to the ecological realm. What does it look like for us in the developed world to fast ecologically? And I told my staff I would give this quick plug. We have, for the Christian world, we developed this national program. It's a faith formation program, imagine this, that uses Lent as the season of Lent as a way to invite Christians to reflect on the environmental impact of their lifestyle. And why do we not have more of these kinds of programs out there? And finally, what I want to end on here is that the way we're going to get where we need to get is, don't shoot me, Tim, but it's not by being scared witless because we're at 400 parts per billion. It's not because of doomsday rhetoric. We're not going to get there through gritted teeth and moral willpower. We will get there by love. We will get there by gratitude, which is our conduit to love. Love is the source, love is the glue that holds our interconnected world together. Love is the omega point to which all things evolve. And we can cultivate a gratitude that connects to this love. We learned how to do it as kids when we learned how to cross the street. Brother David Stendel-Rast has this wonderful formula for cultivating gratitude. He says you have to stop, look, and go. Just like if you were crossing the street. You have to stop and create a contemplative pause in your life. You have to stop and create silence in your life amidst the busyness. And in that pause, you look. You look deeply at the needs of the world, at the needs of all human and non-human creatures. And then you go. You jump into your activism, into your advocacy, into your environmentally responsible behaviors. You do all of this. You go with all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your soul, and all of your strength.
We're going to make this as complicated as possible. Started with a happy picture.
We're in a good place now.
Yeah. Does anybody else really miss Mike Warren? I do. No, I want to actually build on what's been said, and I think that it's really important because there is a response outside of frustration, despair, ignorance, or the idea that we're going to be rescued by technology, or that Jesus is going to come back in time. As a friend of mine who showed the documentary Chasing Ice at Pittsburgh Seminary, at the end of it, she had somebody come up and said, this movie makes me so happy because now I know that the planet is dying fast enough for Jesus to come back sooner. There's a number of theological points we want to make out of that, but not tonight. But we do begin, and I think as Jen said, and as Kyle mentioned, we begin with grief and lamentation. And so that's what I wanted to begin with tonight, was grief and lamentation. The idea that we can approach reality with something other than optimism. Optimism's a lie. What it requires is facing the truth, facing reality in such a way that allows us to then move forward through grief, through lamentation, into hope. And I would echo what both Jen and Kyle said, that this beginning of hope, grief to reality, to wisdom, to wonder, to hope, is the journey that religious educators can lead people on, and we can take ourselves on too. And the first thing we begin is by subverting this myth of infinite progress that underlies not just our late market capitalism, but also our religious faith. That the world will always get better, and things will always be sooner. Well, in a time of restricted and different understanding of what energy means and what our space in that means, maybe we as educators can begin the critical task of renaming the world as a place of limits that is also a place of gratitude and hope. But I also want to think that part of what we need to do is begin to live into whatever places we are beyond the map. As Gregory Bateson said, map is not territory. Every space we live into has its own narrative, its own story, its own possibilities, its own richness, its fertility. And within that place, as we learn our places more and more deeply, we build more resources for creating a deeper and more significant community. This is a couple pictures from our farm where the lettuce grown and the kale grown right next door there is cooked up by one of our chefs, Beth. And we serve it at our dinner table and at our lunch table and for all kinds of stuff with really great food, which has taken about a year for our students to realize is great food. And the loss of fried chicken and frozen hamburgers is not as deep a loss as I think it is. And during the summers, really from about the 1st of April with our hoop houses and other things, whoops, I skipped ahead, we're able to grow between 85 and 93, we're able to grow on campus about 50 to 60% of what we eat. And we source 20 within 20 miles, 85 to 93% of what we eat during growing seasons. It includes all our meats, everything like that. And that's just a commitment. And one of the things, for those of y'all who are going back to an institution, one of the ways to convince an administration to do stuff like this is make it competitive. All of a sudden allow them to think we can become the greenest seminary. Not just green our seminary, but become the greenest. Become that. And I have to say, for all the possibilities, directions we could have gone, I'm really proud to be at an institution that shows ecological vision as a way to kind of make our mark in the world. But we also need to leverage and change and shift our language and our ability to see and figure out where is the prophetic happening in our world. And the prophetic isn't just, it is happening through writers like Walter Brueggemann, Bill Brown, others who are taking on Scripture through an ecological hermeneutic, or through Sally McFaig and others of the Evelyn Tucker, others that have been spoken into being here. But I also want to say it's also happening with Wendell Berry, Mary Oliver, Andrew Hudgens, also with Andy Goldsworthy, with other environmental artists. And this is just an ephemeral sculpture by Andy Goldsworthy, where he takes the leaves that are present in the place he is and helps us to re-see that space in a new way. And what we need is, we need our new eyes. We need to see beyond. Kyle, I agree with Kyle, you can't stay with despair and frustration and anxiety. We have to begin to learn to see the world as the place of abundance that the God we state our belief in created. So if the world is truly abundant, we need to learn to see it in a different way. And in our relearning to see our world, hopefully we can also discover a new language for that. Many of y'all are familiar with the poem, Wendell Berry's Peace of the Wild Things. And Kyle and I have known each other a long, long time, many years. He was probably 12 or 13, probably.
He was my youth minister.
That's how far back we go. But we share a love of Wendell Berry, and so the idea that when despair grows in me, and I wake in the night of the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. And I feel below me the infinite galaxies seeking their light. I'm rewriting Wendell Berry for Kyle. And I rest in the grace of the world and am free. And I'm fully convinced if we can embrace our place as a creature in community with other creatures, that if we can return to our core narratives and understand that we were not as a species set above, but a stage was set for all our thriving. And within that stage that was set for all of our thriving in our creation narratives, we were given one task, and that was to steward the life around us, to maintain the abundance that was set before us, not to exploit all that was given to us. So if we can begin to do that and embrace our place as a creature in community and live into our place in the world, then maybe, just maybe, we might begin to cultivate dreams, vision, and practices that can sustain us for the next 1,000 years. And I don't know what those might be, and I don't know how they might look. And right now in my own teaching and work, it's experimental. As I've told a couple of y'all here, my most exciting class I'm teaching right now is Cultivating Prophetic Hope. And in that course, we began for 3 weeks reading poets and artists, and also Wendell Berry's book on grief, reality, hope, and 3 weeks of grief. And at the end of that 3 weeks, on the 4th week, students brought the poets and the artists they've been living with for 3 weeks and writing about in their journals, and we had a day of presentation. What does it mean to live in that grief? If you all want to be just stunned by grief, get Gary Snyder's latest collection of poems and read the poem he wrote at the death of his wife. It will shatter you, as it shattered us all on that day. And then for the next 3 weeks, we read Muriel Rukeyser, a troublemaking poet from the 20th century who has every right to speak to us today, and it's been somehow written out of our history. Used to travel with Saul Alinsky, who had a real impact on Miles Horton in the Highlander Center. Just spectacular woman, and we dealt with reality. And we read her poem together as a narrative, her poem on the silicosis strike of the 1920s, where she uses different court testimony and witness testimony and all kinds of things. And we read it together and just to work with reality. In week 4, we brought our poets and our artists together and we dealt with reality. And we're just now completing week 3 in Hope. And we're reading William P. Brown's book, Wisdom's Wonder, which is spectacular. And we'll present the week before Thanksgiving with our poets and our artists. We'll all bring them together for a new vision of hope. And we'll finish up with The Mystic, with Douglas Christie's The Blue Sapphire of the Mind, or something along those. This is a spectacular book on the mystical side of ecology. And that's where we're heading. So even though I am Mr. Krabby Pants, I think it is our job and all of our job to somehow envision a new way to cultivate prophetic hope for a different way of being in the world. And that's our job as religious educators. And if we can't do that, we need to go ahead and sell insurance because the fire is coming. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for some questions, reflections, comments.
Hi, my name is Dave from BU, and I work in Boston and live in the city. And so my question is, so I'm probably going to take on the seconds. It's bright enough. And the stars, no.
Yeah, do that.
Not visible. And so as the world grows up, away from the farms, away from the trees, away from the mountains, how do we instill that hope? The poets use metaphors that are meaningless for someone who doesn't see trees. So, and I sort of put that out as a challenge to all of us. I mean, it's sort of like, it feels like a 1%, like the idea of countering nature deficits sort of seems like something for the 1%. And so I wonder, like I'm asking this of the whole room, but anything you guys want to chime in, go for it. How do we address these problems if we're teaching ministers who are going to minister in a city?
Well, that's one of the things we're trying to do at the Earth and Spirit Center. We do have the luxury of 21 acres, but it's right in the middle of the city. And I guess I'd make 2 points. One is that because we are nature, because nature is all around us, it is in cities too. Nature is in the weeds pushing through the sidewalk. Nature is in the trees that struggle in the median strips. So it's findable in every place. But that being said, I'll be a little provocative here. I do not see a sustainable future in which more and more and more of us live in cities. Because I've lived in the countryside, and I know what it looks like to live in a countryside that is radically depopulated. It is not a sustainable future. And so I think we're going to have to contemplate a resettlement of the countryside, hopefully in new ways that are life-giving, and new partnerships between rural areas and urban areas that are life-giving for both.
Eileen and I live lived in Chicago at the same time, so I hear what you're saying. The sky in Chicago is pink at night. And so I hear what you're saying. One person that's instructed for me is Barbara Rossing. I don't know how many of you know Barbara Rossing's work. She's a New Testament scholar and writes on Revelation. And one of the things that she says that in Revelation, stories of a renewed city, that's where renewal and new life comes, is in the city. And I think that's instructive. And I'm not sure how far I want to go down this road because I don't know the science well enough, but I have read some research that suggests that maybe it's not cities of the size and scale that we have, but that there are ways of condensed living that might be lighter on the environment than disbursement. And the last thing I'll say that I was in Haiti in April, and one of the things that was, as you know, that was so catastrophic from the earthquake was that they were in an urban environment that was not sustainable with such poor infrastructure. And so the Papaya peasant movement in Haiti has been encouraging people to establish smaller communities in the rural countryside to try to build self-sufficient communities in the rural countryside. And so I do think that there are better and worse ways of being in the city, and it's irresponsible to not think theologically about life in the city. And so I hear what you're saying. In McCormick, one guy that was often taught was Tim Gorange's book, The Theology of the Built Environment. I'm not sure if people are still using that book, but at least it's a theological reflection on the built environment. So it's not as if there's the environment and then there's human.
I'd also just want to say that the illusion that you live outside of the environment is one we need to overcome. And that the cities are not separated from the rural in that way. There is a different life, but they're not separated. And so, I mean, there are also ways to think about it in that if you were to just look at the waste stream of your city, if you were to look at the energy inputs of your city and where they're coming from, if you look at where your power is made and the kind of energy that is done with that, it's all connected to your city. Where does your food come from? Who grows it? How does it get there? What's the distance it's trucked? Those are all ecological questions. And one just event that I think celebrated a week ago, its millionth tree is in New York City. Bette Midler's little group has planted 1 million trees. A demand that the city not be removed from nature, from who she is. And I think that exists. I mean, Boston, that bay determines the health of the people in the city of Boston. And so to live as if you're removed from that bay is a denial of human existence in that place. And so I think that, I've heard that, I understand the critique, because if we can all walk the kids in the woods, that'll be fine, but you can walk them around the common. You can also put them next to a drainage ditch at the end of a rainfall and figure out what's coming out from their streets above and do a water sample survey. And there are folks at Harvard and MIT, science folks. I mean, one of the excuses you hear for denial is, well, I just don't know the science, I'm not a scientist. I live in central Ohio, and believe me, the folks at OSU are desperate for religious people to invite them into their place so they can begin to talk about the science around climate change. And I know those folks exist at Harvard, I know they exist at MIT, or you can join in partnership to say, what is the ecology of our lived environment? And also, one of the things the city has over the rural is it can overcome this kind of easy mysticism we throw on top of our lived environment. It's easy to have a mystic experience that is all us. David Orr talks about looking into a mountain pond and seeing our reflection and believe that we are the center of all nature. And that's less possible in the city. It's much easier to do and so I think the city has a lot to give folks who live in the rural side of things that can make this conversation much richer. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Good question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mark Hicks from Lombard Theological School in Chicago. I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of a pedagogue, right? So I think you did a really elegant job of sort of laying out the theology of how to make this happen, but I'm also thinking about some of the people that I'm involved with in the environmental justice movement who would have sat through that presentation for probably about 90% of it and said, this doesn't apply to me because my life is not lived in this way. One of the things I've learned from educating people that have been privileged into educated to privileged identities, as opposed to those who are targets of that, is that there needs to be a completely different orientation for having a discussion. And I'd like to hear more about what that feels like and looks like for you, as opposed to a conversation, for example, about the rolling hills and the metaphors and all of those things. So again, it's beautiful, and I understand how we need to connect with that part of nature. But I hear people who will say, why are we doing the Feast of St. Francis, celebrating animals, etc., when I can't breathe? I can't even live my life, and we're talking about other things that are happening. Not to say that both are important, I'm not getting into an either-or thing, but how do we feel pedagogically about having different kinds of offerings for people who experience this problem from radically different ones?
Just really quickly, I cut a third of my first presentation. I had some response to that there, but I was going along. But in Chicago in particular, you have the factory.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a permaculture site within the city to discover those people who are growing food on one level, by using the fish waste on another level, by using the solar on another level, and within that particular space, they're doing an urban permaculture environment. Another thing is a teaching tool, the documentary Urban Roots, looks at the renewal of Detroit through farming, is really a spectacular way that what it means to get young people, to get kids, and this happens in Franklinton and Columbus with one of our alums who started an urban garden area, to get folks who live in poverty who don't even know how to cook because their ovens have never worked, get them on a garden and show them what a green bean actually looks like, or to show them what carrots look like, and to have them pull them and plant them and do all that as part of the education of children is essential. And urban gardening is happening in major cities all over. Chicago's got some great stuff going on. The other thing I'd say is you need to call my colleague Garrett, who also is on our faculty, Tim Everhart, who can light you up with about 300 different people to engage with in that area. And as part of this too is within the urban environment, there are folks asking the question as to how do we reconnect with our world through our food, through water, through energy, and they're doing really creative, wonderful things all throughout. I know the East Coast, but I know I'm more familiar with the Midwest and Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, Chicago, and all those spaces. There's some good stuff happening.
I'll just say quickly, I appreciate your question because I teach a course on religious education in our ecological context. And the first time I taught it, I got 2 students in there who were from big cities who told me on the first day of the class that they were in the class because of the time it meant they heard I was okay. But they didn't really care about the environment at all, they just wanted to let me know. And that was okay with me actually because I think that sometimes the language has such a degree of cultural baggage that people think that the conversation is not their conversation. The first assignment we started working on was tell a story about a place that formed you. And so they got to tell stories about the cities in which they grew up, and I was asking them to think in detail about the places where they grew up. So they had to make these small digital stories. And so one young woman who's from Akron, I think, she told the story about a time when she was a kid and left her house without permission on her bicycle through the streets of Akron, and the police brought her back home. But in telling that story, she told this very detailed ecological story about the place in which she grew up. And so I think having assignments like that immediately explode the categories of what is ecological, what is environmental, are absolutely necessary. And I'm just sort of hoping that eventually the word gets out about the kinds of assignments, because I find myself a little bit at a loss of what to do about the baggage around the terminology. I don't want to give up on the term ecological because I think it's about social equity and social connections as much as it's about connections with nature. So I guess I'm saying I'm with you in the challenge. Yeah, thank you.
So we're at our time, a little past it. Are we ready to bring this to a close then, I believe? Can we, I can't help but think of the description of hope that has two sisters, anger and courage. And I think we've had the beauty of both of those this evening. So we thank you, the three of you, very much for your incredible contribution.